"Get out of here right now," the manager yelled, his face turning red. He pointed angrily at the door, his voice rising with every word. "You don't belong here. I don't know how you thought you could just walk in and waste my time, but I won't have it." The woman stood frozen for a moment, her hand still resting on the sleek black car she had been looking at moments before. She could hear the harshness in his words, the disgust in his tone, but she didn't flinch. She had heard much worse in her life. But this was different. She knew this moment wasn't just about a misunderstanding or an argument. It was personal. Her eyes narrowed as she stared at the manager. His name was Greg Walters, a man she had only heard about in passing, someone who was supposed to be one of the most respected car dealership managers in town. His behavior now, however, made her question that reputation. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. Greg's eyes widened as if he couldn't believe she was still standing there. He crossed his arms over his chest, clearly trying to maintain control of the situation. "You heard me," he snapped, his voice now filled with impatience. "We don't serve your kind here. You don't belong in a place like this." The woman felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. She had been walking around the dealership, looking at the cars, checking out prices, thinking about her purchase, when suddenly Greg had come up to her with an expression full of judgment. He had asked her if she needed help, and when she told him she was just browsing, his attitude had shifted instantly. Now, standing in front of her, he had the nerve to call her out. No, to demand she leave, just because of who she was, the color of her skin. Her blood began to boil. This was the kind of thing she had heard about, but never experienced herself. This was supposed to be a professional environment, but it felt anything but. "I'm sorry, I don't think I heard you correctly," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Did you just say that I don't belong here?" Greg sneered at her, his lip curling. "That's exactly what I said. We have a standard here. People like you don't get to walk in and pretend like you belong. Now get out before I call security." The woman's jaw tightened. She had heard enough. The hurt, the anger, the unfairness, it all hit her like a punch to the stomach. But instead of getting angry, she took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She could feel the eyes of other customers on her. They were watching, some curious, some uncomfortable, some indifferent. She wasn't sure which one bothered her more. But just before she could say another word, the door to the manager's office opened, and a man in a sharp suit walked out. He looked at the situation, his expression unreadable. "Greg, what's going on?" the man asked, his voice smooth but firm. "This woman," Greg started, pointing at the woman as if she were nothing more than an object, "is trying to make a scene. I told her to leave, and she refuses. She's not welcome here." The man in the suit raised an eyebrow, glancing at the woman for the first time. There was a long silence as he took her in. His gaze shifted to Greg, and without saying another word, he walked over to the woman, extending his hand. "I'm sorry for this," he said, his voice unexpectedly warm. "Please follow me." Greg's eyes widened in shock as he saw the man escort the woman past him, not even sparing him a second glance. The manager opened his mouth to protest, but the words stuck in his throat. He stood there, flabbergasted, watching as the woman and the suited man walked toward the back of the dealership. But just as they reached the office doors, the woman stopped, turning around slowly. She met Greg's stunned eyes, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I don't think you fully understand who I am," she said, her voice calm, but there was a bite to it now. Greg looked like he was about to explode, but the man in the suit raised his hand to stop him. "Let's go," he said to the woman. "We'll talk inside." The door clicked shut behind them, leaving Greg standing there, his face a mix of confusion and growing fear. What had just happened? Why was she being treated differently now? Little did Greg know he had just made a grave mistake. The woman he had so quickly dismissed, so wrongly assumed to be nothing more than a problem customer, was about to reveal a truth that would rock the dealership to its very core. The suited man, still walking beside her, gestured to the office with a calm, almost apologetic expression. "Please have a seat," he said. The woman sat down, the soft leather of the chair creaking slightly under her weight. The door clicked shut behind them, and the man took a seat across from her, his expression now much more serious. "I need to apologize for Greg's behavior," he said. "He should never have spoken to you like that. But what you don't know is, the man is very set in his ways. He tends to treat people like they don't matter if they don't fit his idea of who belongs here." The woman stared at him, not sure what to say. The events had unfolded so quickly that it was hard for her to process. The anger inside her was still simmering, but there was something else now, a gnawing curiosity about why the man was so different from the manager. "I'm the owner of this dealership," he continued, his voice steady, "and I'm afraid Greg just made a very big mistake. You see, I've been meaning to meet with you for a while now." At those words, the woman's heart skipped a beat. The owner? The same Greg Walters who had kicked her out. She was starting to realize that she wasn't just another customer. She wasn't just anyone. The man in the suit smiled slightly. "The truth is, I'm not sure how Greg thought he could get away with treating someone like you that way. You see, I already know who you are." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Who am I?" The man looked her in the eyes, his expression softening. "You're the new owner of this dealership." And with that, the woman's world tilted on its axis. The words hung in the air between them, thick with disbelief. The woman's mind raced as she tried to process what the man in front of her had just said. "New owner?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean, new owner?" The man gave a small, knowing smile, as if he had anticipated this confusion. "I'm sorry for the sudden revelation, but it's true. You're the new owner. You've purchased this dealership." His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable seriousness in his tone. The woman's heart raced. She sat back in her chair, trying to take in the full weight of what he had said. This was insane. How could this be? She had just walked in here as a regular customer, no different than anyone else who had come to look at cars. How had she ended up here, being told she was the owner? I didn't buy anything," she stammered, looking at him with wide eyes. "I haven't made any deals. I haven't signed any papers. This must be some kind of mistake." The man leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "There's no mistake. I was in contact with your lawyer. All the paperwork was finalized 2 days ago. You own this dealership now." The words felt like they were in slow motion, sinking in piece by piece, but still not fully making sense. The woman could hardly believe it. She had come here to buy a car, maybe trade in her old one, but owning the whole dealership? It didn't make sense. I don't have a lawyer," she said, trying to steady her voice. "I didn't sign anything. I don't." The man cut her off gently, his voice now quieter. "You do have a lawyer, and you signed everything. Trust me, I've seen the documents myself. Your signature is on them." She stared at him, still in disbelief. She had never heard of any such transaction. She didn't even own anything remotely close to the money it would take to buy a dealership, especially one like this, big, well-established, with a long history. "This doesn't make any sense," she muttered under her breath. "Who would even sell a place like this to me? I don't know anything about running a dealership." He nodded, his expression softening. "I understand your confusion. But the thing is, this dealership was in danger of going under. The previous owner was struggling financially. And when you walked in here, Greg, well, he was instructed not to let anyone know about the deal. But you were chosen for a reason. We've been watching you for a while." Her stomach turned. "Watching me?" "Yes," the man said, his voice steady but with an edge of finality. "We've been following your career. You've been doing quite well for yourself in the business world, and this dealership needed someone who could handle its potential. Someone who could turn it around." The woman blinked, her mind still racing. She wasn't sure whether to feel insulted or honored, watching her. She had no idea anyone had been paying attention to her. She was just trying to get by, like everyone else. "Why me?" she finally asked, her voice thick with confusion. "Why choose me? I don't have experience with cars, with sales, or with managing something like this." The man leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he considered her question. It's not just about selling cars. It's about seeing potential in places others can't. This dealership is a lot more than it seems. There's a history here. A legacy. And I believe you're the person who can make it thrive again. She felt a chill run through her, the words sinking deeper into her. It wasn't just a dealership, it was a legacy. Her mind flicked back to the look on Greg's face, the shock in his eyes when she had stood up to him. It all started to make a twisted kind of sense now. But there was one thing she couldn't shake. "Greg," she said, her voice steady, though she could feel the anger bubbling up again. "What about Greg? He just kicked me out. I don't think he's going to take kindly to this." The man sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Greg, well, Greg has been a problem for a while now. He's been with the dealership for years, but his views, his behavior, let's just say he's not someone we want in charge of things anymore." The woman frowned. "You mean you were planning on getting rid of him anyway?" "Exactly," the man said, his tone firm. "But now, with you here, it's going to be a lot easier to make that happen. We can't have someone like Greg running the show, especially with the way he treats people. We need fresh blood. We need someone who understands that things need to change." A sudden, cold thought crossed her mind. "And Greg doesn't know any of this, does he?" "No," the man said with a smile. "Not yet. But I'm sure he'll find out soon enough." Her mind swirled. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had walked into this dealership as just another customer, and now she was being told that not only was she the new owner, but she had also been selected to take over a business that was teetering on the edge of disaster. But what about Greg? What about the employees, the customers, the whole operation? What was she supposed to do with all of this now? "Wait," she said as the weight of the situation sank in. "I don't even know how to run a dealership. How am I supposed to fix all this?" The man smiled gently, almost as if he had been waiting for her to ask that very question. "That's where I come in. I'm going to help you, guide you. We'll figure it out together." She was still reeling, trying to absorb it all. But there was one thing she knew for sure. Her life was never going to be the same again. "Before we move forward," the man said, standing up, "I think you should take a tour of your new business. It's yours now, after all." The woman stood slowly, her legs feeling like they might give way beneath her. This was real. She was the owner. And if this was going to work, she had to figure out what came next. She followed the man through the back hallways of the dealership, her mind still spinning with disbelief. They passed by rows of vehicles, some luxury cars, some older models, all gleaming under the fluorescent lights. But her thoughts were interrupted by a voice. "Hey, what's going on? Where's Greg?" She turned to see one of the salesmen, a tall man with a scruffy beard, walking toward them. His expression was one of confusion. The man in the suit, her new business partner, smiled and turned to the salesman. "Greg's not going to be here much longer," he said cryptically. The salesman raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? Is something going on?" The woman felt a twinge of unease. The tension in the air was palpable now. She didn't know what was about to happen, but she was beginning to sense that things were about to escalate quickly. Before anyone could answer, Greg's voice suddenly echoed down the hallway. "What's going on here? I demand to know." She turned to see him storming toward them, his face full of rage. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. Greg was about to find out the truth. Greg stormed down the hallway, his footsteps heavy with authority. His face was red with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. The woman couldn't help but notice the fury in his eyes as he approached, his gaze shifting from her to the man in the suit beside her. "What's going on here?" Greg demanded again, his voice harsh, cutting through the tension in the air. "Who the hell are you? And why is she still here? She was supposed to be thrown out." The man in the suit remained calm, almost unnervingly so, as if he had been expecting this confrontation. He turned toward Greg, his posture rigid but controlled. "Greg," the man said quietly, "you need to step back. This isn't what you think." Greg sneered. "What, now you're playing games with me too? Who do you think you are letting this?" He pointed at the woman, as if she were a nuisance, run around in my dealership. I don't care who she is. She doesn't belong here. The woman felt her anger rise again, but she forced herself to stay calm. She was done being the victim in this situation. She had spent too long being pushed around and underestimated by people like Greg. She wasn't going to let him get away with it. I belong here, she said firmly, taking a step forward. And I'm not going anywhere. Greg's eyes widened in disbelief. What did you say? The man in the suit shot her a quick glance, a faint smile on his face, before addressing Greg again. Greg, I think you should sit down. We need to have a serious conversation. Greg bristled. I don't have time for this. This woman has no business being here, and neither do you. If you think I'm going to let you... Greg, the man interrupted sharply, his tone suddenly turning colder. I think you should take a moment to calm down, because if you don't, I will be forced to make a decision that might not work in your favor. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. For a split second, Greg's expression faltered, but then his defiance returned stronger than ever. You think you can intimidate me with your fancy words? Who the hell do you think you are? The woman felt a flicker of dread. Whatever was about to happen, it was clear that Greg wasn't going to go down without a fight. And she had a feeling that the man in the suit wasn't just going to let it slide. The man, who had yet to give his name, looked at Greg with something akin to pity, then back at the woman. I think it's time we fill Greg in, don't you? The woman nodded, a tight smile pulling at the corners of her lips. She didn't care what Greg thought anymore. She had already been dismissed once today, and now she was going to make sure he never underestimated her again. I'll let you in on a little secret, Greg, she said, her voice cool but dripping with a new sense of authority. I'm not just a customer. I own this place now. Greg's face twisted in confusion and shock. What? He looked from her to the man in the suit, then back at her again, his disbelief clear. He sputtered, looking for the right words. That's impossible. You can't be serious. I'm very serious, the woman replied, her voice steady. I just found out myself, but it's true. I'm the new owner of this dealership. For a moment there was complete silence. Greg's anger seemed to freeze in place, his mouth working as if he were trying to say something, but no words came out. It was as though his mind couldn't quite catch up to the revelation. Greg's voice finally broke through the silence, but it was filled with venom. He gestured toward the man in the suit. You're in on this, aren't you? You set this up. The man in the suit sighed, shaking his head. Greg, you've been with this dealership for a long time. But the truth is, this place is under new ownership now. I can't have someone like you working here anymore. Not with the way you treat people. Greg's face twisted into a mask of fury. What are you saying? You can't just throw me out. I've worked here for years. I built this place. The woman stepped forward, her voice firm. You may have been here for years, but you've been running it into the ground. You think I don't know what's been happening? The way you treat customers, your attitude, your blatant disrespect. It's been noticed by more people than you realize. Greg looked taken aback. It was clear now that he hadn't expected anyone to confront him like this, especially not a woman he had so quickly dismissed. His face reddened again, but this time it was from embarrassment and simmering rage. He took a deep breath, trying to control his anger. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. This is my domain. You can't just come in here and take it from me. The man in the suit stepped forward. It's not your domain anymore, Greg. You're fired. Effective immediately. The words hit Greg like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he stood there speechless before his eyes narrowed in pure hatred. You think you can just kick me out? You think I'm going to walk away quietly? I don't care how you walk away, Greg, the man said, his voice calm but final. But you're no longer welcome here. Now please leave. Greg's fists clenched at his sides. He looked between the woman and the man in the suit, his mind racing, but he was outnumbered. His defiance slowly faded as he realized he had lost. You'll regret this, he spat, his voice thick with anger. You can't just do this to me. I'll make sure you pay. The woman stood her ground, her eyes unwavering. I'm not afraid of you, Greg. Now get out." For a long moment, Greg stood there, seething with rage, his chest heaving as he struggled to contain himself. Finally, he turned on his heel and stormed out, his footsteps echoing in the silence he left behind. The door slammed behind him with a force that made the walls tremble. The woman exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment finally lift. She was still trying to process everything, still grappling with the enormity of what had just happened. But one thing was clear. Greg was gone, and the dealership was now in her hands. The man in the suit turned to her, his expression softening. "You handled that well," he said with a nod. "You've got a strong backbone. I like that." She shook her head, still in disbelief. "I never expected any of this. I came in here just to look at cars. I didn't know I was walking into something like this." He smiled again, a glint of approval in his eyes. "Life works in strange ways. But now you have a dealership to run, and it's going to take all of your strength, your focus, and your intelligence to turn it around. You're the right person for the job, but this is only the beginning." Her stomach tightened at the thought. She hadn't expected to be thrown into the deep end this quickly. But as the reality of the situation began to settle in, she realized he was right. She was in charge now, and there was no turning back. The man in the suit stood up. "Let's take a tour of your new business, shall we?" She nodded slowly, her mind still buzzing with the weight of the decisions ahead of her. As they walked through the dealership, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a business deal. She had a lot to learn and fast. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let anyone push her around again. Not Greg, not anyone. And that was only the beginning. The dealership was quiet after Greg's departure. The once bustling showroom now seemed strangely hollow, almost like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The woman followed the man in the suit through the rows of shiny cars, her mind spinning with everything that had just unfolded. She was still processing the fact that she now owned the dealership, but there was no time to dwell on it. It was real, and she had to act like it. The man glanced over at her, his hands folded behind his back. "This place isn't as bad as it seems," he said, his voice warm but steady. "But it's going to need a lot of work. There's a lot you'll need to address, especially with the employees." The woman nodded slowly. "I get that," she said, trying to keep her tone even. "But I don't know where to start. I don't know the first thing about running a car dealership. How do I even begin?" He smiled, his eyes gleaming with something close to admiration. "That's where I come in. I've been running dealerships for years. I can help you figure it out. You won't be alone in this." She glanced around the showroom again, looking at the array of cars on display. There was so much here: luxury models, sedans, SUVs. It should have been overwhelming, but instead it felt like a maze of opportunity, just waiting for her to take the first step. She looked back at him, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I don't even know if I can do this. It feels like everything is stacked against me. I didn't even want to own a dealership, and now I'm supposed to turn this place around." He paused, considering her words for a moment. "It's not going to be easy. Running a business never is. But you've got the drive, the instincts. That's something you can't teach. And don't forget, you've already proven you can handle difficult situations." He glanced toward the back office where Greg had stormed out earlier. "You stood up to Greg when most people would back down." She felt a flush of pride at his words, but the doubt was still there. Greg had been a bully, but this was a whole different level. Owning a business came with a set of challenges that she had never imagined. The stakes were higher now. The man in the suit gestured toward the door leading to the service area. "Why don't we start with the basics? You need to know your assets. Let's meet with the sales staff and the service team. Get a feel for what you're working with." She nodded, taking a deep breath. There was no backing out now. As they walked through the back corridors, the hum of activity from the service bays grew louder. "I'm Melissa," she said with a friendly smile. "I handle a lot of the paperwork, the scheduling for service appointments, all that. Nice to meet you, boss." The woman shook her hand, her grip firm but not overly forceful. "Nice to meet you too, Melissa. I know this must be a big change, but I'm hoping we can all work together to make things better here." The mechanic grunted in acknowledgement but didn't seem convinced. If you're asking about sales numbers, you're gonna be disappointed. This place has been bleeding money for a while now. Greg wasn't exactly the best at keeping things together, if you catch my drift. The woman felt a pang of frustration at the mention of Greg's name, but she pushed it down. She needed to stay focused. I understand. That's why I'm here. We need to turn things around, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes. But I'll need your help. The mechanic shifted uncomfortably. Help, huh? Well, I've been working here a long time. But don't expect any miracles. I'm good with cars, but this whole business side of things, not my scene. The woman nodded. I get it. But if we all pull together, we can make a difference. This dealership has a lot of potential. I believe that. The man in the suit, who had been standing silently by the door, now stepped forward. She's right. But turning things around won't be easy. We're going to need new strategies. We'll need a better inventory system, updated marketing, and more customer engagement. We can't keep doing things the same way if we want to survive. Melissa spoke up, her voice a little hesitant but hopeful. I've heard talk about new ownership, but this is the first time we're actually meeting the person behind it. So what's your plan? The woman felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. They were looking to her for answers, but she had so many questions herself. She swallowed hard and took a breath. I'm still figuring it out, she admitted, her voice steady despite the nerves. But first, I want to meet with the sales team. I need to understand what's going wrong in that department. We've got to get the cars moving or we'll never make it. The mechanic shrugged. That's Greg's department. He was always focused on the big-ticket sales, and if he didn't like someone, he just kicked them out. I'm sure you saw that firsthand today. The woman's jaw tightened at the memory of Greg's dismissal, but she nodded. I'll have to address that. I can't have people feeling like they don't belong here. Good luck with that, the mechanic said dryly. I don't think Greg's gonna take kindly to being kicked to the curb. He's got connections. The woman turned to him, her eyes narrowing slightly. I'm not worried about Greg's connections. I'm worried about this business surviving. She turned back to the man in the suit, who had been watching the interaction quietly. So what's next? We start with sales. He nodded. Yes, but we also need to address some bigger issues, like the lack of any effective marketing strategies. People don't even know this dealership exists half the time. She sighed. It was overwhelming, but there was no going back now. She had to fix it. She had to make this place work, even if it meant learning things she never imagined. Just then, a sudden noise cut through the conversation. A loud, sharp sound of something shattering. The woman whipped around, her heart racing. What was that? She demanded, already moving toward the source of the noise. The mechanic followed her, and as they rounded the corner, they stopped dead in their tracks. In the middle of the showroom, a large window had been shattered. A stone lay on the floor, surrounded by the broken glass. The woman's stomach dropped. This was no accident. Someone had thrown that stone. And suddenly she realized things were about to get a lot more complicated. The sharp noise of shattering glass echoed through the dealership, reverberating off the walls and leaving a strange, eerie silence in its wake. The woman stood frozen for a moment, staring at the stone lying in the middle of the showroom floor, surrounded by the jagged shards of glass. The air felt heavy, charged with tension. The mechanic was the first to move, stepping cautiously toward the broken window. His boots crunched over the scattered glass as he picked up the stone, holding it in his hand like it was something dangerous. He examined it briefly, then looked up at the woman. Someone's sending a message, he said grimly, his voice low. And it's not a friendly one. The woman felt a chill run down her spine. She had no idea who would want to send her a message, but it wasn't lost on her that this was more than just a random act of vandalism. The stone had been deliberately thrown through the window, and whoever had done it wanted her to know they were watching. Who could it be? She asked, her voice shaking slightly. She was trying to stay calm, but the weight of the situation was starting to sink in. The mechanic shrugged. Could be anyone, but the fact that it happened right here, right now, with everything going on, it feels personal. The woman turned to the man in the suit, who had remained quiet so far, his arms crossed as he surveyed the damage. He was calm, too calm considering the circumstances. "This is more serious than you're making it out to be," she said, her voice firm. "Whoever did this knows I'm the new owner, and they're sending a clear message." He gave a small nod but didn't seem as rattled as she expected. "It's definitely a warning, but we can't panic. We need to find out who's behind it and why." The woman didn't respond immediately. Panic wasn't the answer, she knew that. But as she stood there, the weight of the situation felt heavier with each passing second. She had come into this business with high hopes of turning things around, of making it work. But now someone was making it clear they didn't want her here, and the stone was just the beginning. "Do you have security cameras?" she asked, her voice clipped. "Of course," the man in the suit replied. "Let's check the footage." They made their way to the security office, where a small screen showed feeds from various cameras around the dealership. The room was dim, the only light coming from the glow of the monitors. The man in the suit punched a few buttons on the keyboard and pulled up the footage from the cameras nearest the showroom. The woman watched, her eyes glued to the screen. The footage was grainy, but it was enough to make out the figure of someone walking along the sidewalk outside the dealership. They paused by the window for a moment, then tossed something at it before disappearing into the night. "That's the person who threw the stone," she said, pointing at the screen. The man in the suit leaned in closer. "Looks like a man, but it's hard to tell." He was quick, almost like he knew the cameras were there. She bit her lip, feeling a sense of urgency. "Can we get a better look at him? Do we have any closer shots?" He scrolled through the footage, fast-forwarding until they reached a clearer angle. The man was wearing a hoodie, his face partially obscured by a scarf, but she could see enough to know this wasn't an isolated incident. Whoever had done this knew what they were doing. "I think we need to take this to the police," she said, her voice cold and measured. The man in the suit gave her a look of hesitation. "The police? Do you really think they'll be able to do anything with this? It's just a broken window after all." "It's not just a broken window," she snapped. "Someone's trying to intimidate me. I don't know who or why, but I'm not going to sit back and let them get away with it." The man in the suit raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "All right, if you're sure. But you need to be careful. Whoever is behind this might not stop with just a stone." She could hear the edge in his voice, but she didn't care. She couldn't let fear control her. She had already let it control her life for too long. This was her chance to take control, to prove that she was stronger than any of this. "I don't care what they do," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not backing down." The mechanic, who had been standing off to the side, suddenly spoke up. "You're right about one thing, this isn't just about a broken window. Whoever did this wants to send a message. But we don't know what that message is yet. We need to find out who they are and why they're doing this." The woman turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "You think you know something?" The mechanic shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe. Greg might have some enemies. He wasn't exactly a nice guy. A lot of people didn't like the way he ran things around here." She felt a sick feeling in her stomach. Greg had been ruthless, but could his enemies really be targeting her because of him? Was she a pawn in some kind of grudge he'd left behind? "Is there anyone who could have had a personal vendetta against Greg?" she asked, trying to piece things together. The mechanic nodded slowly. "There were rumors about some shady business dealings. Greg wasn't exactly transparent with his finances, and I know he pissed off a lot of people who were looking to buy the dealership. But he'd always managed to push people around. I'm guessing someone's finally had enough." The woman's mind raced. Greg had been a problem, but had he left behind a trail of enemies that would now come after her? She had no idea what she was walking into when she took over this place, and now it seemed like the problems were just beginning. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. The man in the suit opened it, revealing one of the salesmen standing in the doorway, his face pale. "Boss," he said, his voice shaky. "You need to see this." The woman exchanged a glance with the man in the suit before following the salesman back into the showroom. When she saw what he was pointing at, her heart skipped a beat. On the floor, just a few feet from the shattered window, was a stack of flyers. They were bright and garish, the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a cheap ad campaign. But what caught her attention was the bold black lettering across the top of the page. New OUNER. Same old failure. The woman bent down to pick one up, feeling the weight of the words. The flyers were clearly aimed at her, and they made one thing perfectly clear. Someone wanted to make sure that she knew she wasn't welcome. She straightened up, her mind racing. Who was behind this? Why was someone so determined to sabotage her before she even had a chance to prove herself? And what was she going to do about it? The bright, bold letters on the flyers seemed to mock her. New OUNER. Same old failure. It felt like a punch to the gut, an instant reminder that she was not welcome here. The words burned in her mind as she stared down at the paper, her fingers gripping it tight. Her heart raced, but she refused to let the anger and fear consume her. Whoever was behind this wanted her to panic, to second-guess herself, but she couldn't afford that. Not now. What is this? The man in the suit asked, his voice calm but with an edge of concern. The woman straightened up, her eyes still fixed on the flyers. I guess this is their way of saying they don't approve of me being here. She crumpled the flyer in her fist, but I won't let them push me out. The mechanic, who had followed them back into the showroom, shook his head. This is more than just a little protest. Whoever's doing this has access. They know things about the dealership, about you. This isn't some random act. The woman's mind raced. What did they know? Was someone inside the dealership involved? She couldn't afford to trust anyone blindly. Not anymore. Craig's departure had left a void, and it seemed that others were eager to fill it with their own agendas. We need to figure out who's behind this, she said, her voice steady but urgent. We can't let them keep intimidating me like this. The man in the suit nodded, his expression hardening. I agree, but we need to be careful. This is bigger than just broken windows and flyers. If they're willing to go this far, they might be willing to escalate. I'm not going to back down, the woman said firmly. I'm not leaving. But I need to know who's behind this. And I need to make sure they understand that I'm in charge now. I don't care how many flyers they print or how many windows they break. This dealership is mine. The mechanic looked at her, his face hardening with a mixture of respect and something else. Something that felt like fear. You might not care about the flyers, but the people who are behind this. They might be willing to do more than just send messages. You need to be ready for whatever comes next. She nodded, her jaw clenched. I'll be ready. But first, we need to figure out who's behind this. If it's Greg's people, we'll deal with them. But if it's someone else, we'll have to be smart about it. The man in the suit glanced at the broken window again, his eyes narrowed in thought. We need more information. Someone's been feeding this information, and if we can track it back, we might get a lead. The woman took a deep breath, her mind working quickly. They had a few leads, but they were far from answers. Whoever was behind this had access to the dealership, and if they were willing to sabotage her business so publicly, they weren't going to stop anytime soon. I'll talk to the sales team, she said, her voice taking on a tone of resolve. If anyone knows what's going on here, it's them. The man in the suit raised an eyebrow. You're trusting the sales team. She met his gaze. I have no choice. If we're going to figure this out, we need to know what's happening in every corner of this place. Sales, service, the office. I don't care where the answers come from, but I need to know everything. The mechanic shook his head, muttering under his breath, but didn't argue. He seemed to sense the finality in her voice. She turned to leave the showroom, the flyers still crumpled in her hand. The man in the suit followed her, and they made their way toward the sales floor. The dealership was eerily quiet now, the usual hum of conversations and the buzz of the sales staff muted. A few of the salespeople were scattered throughout the room, chatting in small groups or reviewing paperwork. As they entered, a few heads turned and the woman felt the weight of their gaze. She could tell that word had already spread about the broken window. And now, The flyers would only add fuel to the fire. They were waiting for her to make the next move. She walked up to the nearest salesman, a young man in his late 20s with messy brown hair and a nervous smile. "Hi," she said, keeping her voice calm. "I'm the new owner. We need to talk." The salesman shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the others. "About what?" "About the flyers," she said, holding up the crumpled paper in her hand. "You've seen them. I need to know who's behind this." He hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously to the others, then back at her. "I don't know who did it. Honestly, I have no idea." She raised an eyebrow, not buying his story. "Really? You expect me to believe that? The flyers have your dealership's name on them, and they're targeting me. You don't think that's something we need to worry about?" The salesman shifted on his feet. I don't know. But Craig had some enemies, people who were upset about the way things were run here." The woman's stomach churned. Greg's name had come up again. Was this the fallout from his time here? "Who were they?" she asked, her voice now quiet but urgent. Who were the people Greg was dealing with? The salesman glanced over his shoulder, as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. He leaned in slightly. "Look, I don't know all the details, but Greg had some shady deals with car suppliers. He was always making promises that he couldn't keep, and he pissed off a few people who were trying to get a foot in the door here. But Greg? He didn't care about anyone but himself. He'd throw anyone under the bus to save his own skin." The woman absorbed his words, trying to piece together the puzzle. If Greg had made enemies, that might explain why the sabotage was escalating. Someone was angry, and they were taking it out on her. But who? And why now? The salesman continued, his voice dropping lower. "There's one guy, Tony, who used to work here. He left a while ago, but I heard he was involved in some of Greg's messes. He might know something. But I wouldn't go looking for him. Tony's not someone you want to mess with." The woman's pulse quickened at the mention of Tony. If Greg had dealings with someone like him, it was no surprise that things were going downhill so fast. "Where can I find him?" she asked, her voice hardening. The salesman swallowed, looking reluctant. "You don't want to do this. Tony's a bad guy. He doesn't care about anyone. But if you really want to know, he hangs out at a bar on the edge of town. The place is called the Rusty Nail. It's a dive, and I wouldn't go near it unless you're ready for trouble." The woman nodded, her mind already racing. This was the lead she needed. She had to go see Tony. But she had to be careful. If Greg had made enemies like this, there was no telling what kind of danger she was walking into. "We'll see about Tony," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. As she turned to leave, a cold chill ran down her spine. She was stepping deeper into a world she didn't fully understand. And the further she went, the more she realized, no matter how far she tried to distance herself from Greg's legacy, it would always find a way to drag her back in. The air in the dealership felt thick, like a storm was brewing. As the woman walked back to her office, she could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders. The flyer, the broken window, the cryptic warnings, everything pointed to one thing. She was being targeted, and the people behind it wouldn't stop until they had driven her out. But the mention of Tony, the shady character from Greg's past, ignited a spark of determination in her. If she could find out what he knew, maybe she could put an end to all of this. The questions swirled in her mind as she prepared to leave. Who was Tony? Why was he tied to Greg's messes? And what did he have to do with the sabotage? She had no time to waste. The man in the suit had insisted on coming with her, but she wasn't sure if that was a good idea. This wasn't going to be a friendly conversation, and she didn't want anyone getting hurt, least of all him. "I'm going to the Rusty Nail," she told him as she packed her things. "I don't think you should come. It's not the safest place." He raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "You sure about this? This Tony guy sounds like trouble." "I have to do this," she replied. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "If we don't get answers from him, we're back at square one. I'm not letting this place fall apart." The man in the suit hesitated, then nodded. "All right, But if you're going, I'm getting you a car. You don't want to drive there yourself. Trust me." She didn't argue. The Rusty Nail was on the outskirts of town, a place where things could get dangerous fast. If Tony was the kind of guy the salesman had hinted at, she couldn't risk showing up alone. He made a call, and within minutes, a black SUV was waiting for her outside. The woman climbed in without a word, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach as they drove through the darkening streets. The city lights blurred past the windows, and the further they went, the more the area seemed to transform. The homes became fewer, the buildings smaller, and the pavement cracked and worn. Eventually, they reached a stretch of road lined with rundown businesses and old motels. The Rusty Nail stood at the end of the block, a grimy, neon sign glowing dimly above the door. It was everything she'd expected and more. The car came to a stop in front of the bar, and she took a deep breath. The man in the suit parked across the street and gave her a look. "Be careful. I don't like this place, but if you need me, I'm just a call away." "I'll be fine," she said, her voice steady. "I need to do this alone." With that, she got out of the car and crossed the street, her boots clicking against the uneven pavement. The moment she stepped inside the Rusty Nail, the smell hit her: stale beer, smoke, and something darker, almost like mildew. The dim light flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across the worn-out furniture and the ragged group of patrons seated at the bar. There was no one in a suit here, no one who looked like they had any real power. Just a bunch of rough-looking guys nursing drinks and exchanging hushed words. She scanned the room for Tony, but there was no obvious sign of him. The bartender, a grizzled older man with a thick beard and a scar that ran down his cheek, noticed her as soon as she walked in. His eyes narrowed slightly, taking her in. "What'll it be?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "I'm looking for someone," she replied, keeping her voice low. "Tony." The bartender's expression flickered for a moment, then he gave a slight nod toward the back corner of the bar. "Back there," he muttered, "but don't expect him to be friendly." She thanked him quietly and walked toward the back, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know exactly what she was walking into, but she couldn't back down now. This was her only chance to get the answers she needed. The man sitting at the corner table was hard to miss. He was older than she expected, mid-40s at least, with a scruffy beard and a black leather jacket that looked like it had seen better days. His face was rough, like he'd been through 100 bar fights, and his eyes were cold and calculating. He was watching her as she approached, his gaze sharp, sizing her up. "You're the new owner of the dealership, huh?" he said, his voice low but clear. There was no hint of warmth, only a quiet recognition. "I heard you were asking about me." She didn't sit down. She didn't need to. She'd come for answers, not for small talk. "I need to know about Greg," she said, her voice firm. "What kind of business did he have with you?" Tony smirked but didn't answer right away. He took a slow drag from his cigarette, watching her through the smoke as he exhaled. "Greg was a snake, always making deals under the table, never playing straight. I don't know why you're looking for answers from me. I wasn't the one who screwed him over." "I don't care about Greg," she replied, leaning in slightly. "I care about who's messing with my business now. Who's behind the sabotage at the dealership?" Tony's eyes hardened. He put out the cigarette in the ashtray, then leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Sabotage, huh? Sounds like you've pissed off the wrong people, lady. The question is, who?" Greg had a lot of enemies. Some of them don't care if he's gone. They're still waiting for payback. The woman's pulse quickened. "Who are they?" Tony gave her a long, measuring look, like he was weighing whether or not to answer. The silence stretched on, and just as she was about to push harder, he spoke again. "You're walking into something bigger than you realize," he said slowly. "This isn't just about Greg anymore. It's about power, about control. There are people who want that dealership, and they'll do anything to get it. They don't care who they hurt." The words landed like a punch. People wanted the dealership. Who were they? And why hadn't anyone mentioned this before? Who wants it? She pressed, "Who's behind it?" Tony leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I don't know for sure, but I'd bet my last dollar it's someone from the other side of the fence, someone who used to work with Greg, and they won't stop until they get what they want. You should have stayed out of it, Liddy. This thing's going to get ugly." The woman felt a chill spread through her. Whoever was after the dealership wasn't just trying to scare her off, they were trying to take it from her. And if Tony was right, they had the power to make her life miserable until she gave it up. She had to get out of there. But as she stood to leave, Tony's voice stopped her. "You'd better be careful. And if you ever come back here looking for answers, remember, you might not like what you find." She didn't say another word. She turned and walked out of the bar, her mind racing with the implications of everything Tony had just told her. As she stepped outside, the weight of the situation hit her all at once. She wasn't just fighting for control of the dealership anymore. She was up against people who had no qualms about using violence and intimidation to get what they wanted. The woman's thoughts swirled as she headed back toward the car. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare her. They were playing a much bigger game. And if she didn't figure out who they were, she might lose everything. The drive back from the Rusty Nail was a blur. The woman's mind raced, her thoughts tumbling over one another as she tried to process what Tony had said. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but there were still so many gaps. She knew one thing for sure now: this wasn't just some personal vendetta against her. It was a fight for control, for power, and she had unwittingly stepped into the middle of it. The black SUV hummed steadily beneath her as the man in the suit drove her back toward the dealership. His silence only amplified the tension in the car. Neither of them had spoken much since leaving the bar. She wasn't sure what to say. She had hoped Tony would offer something more concrete, a name, a face, anything. But all he'd given her were vague threats and cryptic warnings. The whole thing felt like a game, but the stakes were too high. As the car turned down the familiar street leading to the dealership, she felt the weight of the situation pressing down harder than ever. Whoever was behind this wasn't just a shadow in the background anymore. They were actively targeting her, trying to break her. And Tony's warning about how ugly things were going to get echoed in her mind. The man in the suit pulled up to the dealership, and they both stared at the building for a moment. It was still and quiet, but the woman could feel the unease radiating from the very walls. Nothing was going to be the same here. The moment she stepped inside, she knew she'd be facing something much bigger than her and the dealership. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what was coming next, but she had no choice. The only option was to fight. The car came to a stop, and she got out without a word, her boots clicking softly on the pavement. As she entered the dealership, she noticed that the sales floor had an uneasy energy to it. The staff were whispering amongst themselves, casting furtive glances toward her. The broken window had been cleaned up, but the remnants of the earlier chaos still hung in the air. Her office door was open, and the man in the suit followed her in. She took a seat at her desk, trying to calm the racing thoughts in her head. She didn't have time to waste. "We need a plan," she said, her voice firm. "Whoever is behind this, whatever game they're playing, they want the dealership, and they'll stop at nothing to get it." The man in the suit nodded slowly, his expression grim. "I agree, but we don't have all the pieces yet. We still don't know who's pulling the strings behind the scenes. Tony wasn't willing to give us a name." "I know," she replied, leaning forward, her eyes intense. "But Tony wasn't the only lead. Someone has to know something. We just need to dig deeper. It's the only way we'll get ahead of this." The man in the suit paused and spoke, his voice low and careful. "I think there's something you need to know. The dealership wasn't just in financial trouble when Greg ran it. He made a lot of enemies in this town, people who could move mountains if they wanted to. But there's one name that keeps coming up: Caleb Thornton." Her heart skipped a beat. Caleb Thornton. She had heard the name before, but only in passing. He was a businessman, one of the wealthiest in the area, with deep ties to the city's power structure. If he was involved in this, it explained a lot. "He's one of the biggest players in this town," the man in the suit continued. "A lot of people own him, whether it's money or favors, Greg probably had some dealings with him that went south. If Caleb's after the dealership, it's not just business. It's personal. The woman's mind reeled as she processed the new information. Caleb Thornton had the means, the connections, and the ruthlessness to take what he wanted. And if Greg had crossed him, where do I find him? She asked, her voice steady despite the rising tension inside her. The man in the suit hesitated for a moment, then spoke, choosing his words carefully. He's not someone you can just walk up to. Caleb runs in the highest circles. His business dealings are above board in public, but behind closed doors, he's ruthless. The best bet would be to go through his associates, maybe one of the people he trusts. She stood up suddenly, feeling the weight of the situation settle in her bones. Then I'll go to him. I'm not going to let him destroy this place without a fight. The man in the suit opened his mouth to say something but then stopped himself. He could see the fire in her eyes, the determination that burned brighter than any fear she might be feeling. She wasn't going to back down. "All right," he said after a pause. "But this won't be easy. If Caleb's really behind this, he's not going to play fair. And we need to be careful." She nodded, her jaw tight. "I don't care how hard it gets. I didn't come this far to lose now." The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls, research, and strategizing. The woman and the man in the suit pored over every scrap of information they could find on Caleb Thornton. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. Caleb had his fingers in nearly every major deal in town. Construction, real estate, car dealerships. He had his hands on everything, and he knew how to get what he wanted. It became clear that Greg had been a small piece of a much larger game, a pawn in Caleb's plan. But why had Greg's failure, and now her arrival, triggered Caleb's interest in the dealership? The answers were elusive, but there was no time to waste. They had to act fast. By the time night fell, the woman was sitting at her desk, feeling more certain than ever that Caleb Thornton was the key to everything. She didn't know if confronting him head-on was the right move, but she couldn't afford to wait any longer. Just as she was about to call it a night, her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but she answered anyway. "Hello," she said, her voice cautious. There was a pause on the other end, and then a deep, gravelly voice spoke, sending a chill down her spine. "You think you can just waltz in here and take what's mine?" The voice said. "I don't think you understand how things work in this town. You're already in over your head." Her breath caught in her throat. She knew who it was. "It's Caleb Thornton, isn't it?" she said, trying to keep her voice steady. A soft laugh crackled over the line. "You're a smart one, but don't get cocky. You're in my territory now. I own this town and everything in it, including you." The line went dead. The woman stared at the phone for a long moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure if Caleb had been bluffing, or if he was serious, but one thing was clear: he had just made it personal. Now it wasn't just about saving the dealership. It was about survival. The phone call with Caleb Thornton echoed in her mind long after the line had gone dead. His words haunted her. "I own this town and everything in it, including you." The chill that ran down her spine was unlike anything she had ever felt. This wasn't just about a dealership anymore. This was a battle for control, and Caleb wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed. She leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on the wall in front of her. The dealership was quiet tonight, almost too quiet. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound. She could feel the weight of every decision she had made, every move she had taken to get this far. And now it felt like the walls were closing in on her. The man in the suit had been right. This was bigger than she had thought. Caleb Thornton wasn't just some businessman with a few bad habits. He was the puppet master pulling the strings, and she had unknowingly stepped right into his web. Caleb Thornton, she muttered under her breath. She had to find a way to stop him, to take back control. But how? He was untouchable, powerful, and had connections that stretched further than she could even imagine. There was no one she could trust now. Tony, the man at the bar, had hinted at how far Caleb's influence reached. He had power in all the right places, the kind of power that made it almost impossible to fight back. The woman thought of the mechanic, the salesman, the man in the suit. She had no idea who was loyal, who was working with Caleb, and who might still be on her side. But if she was going to win this battle, she had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than Caleb ever expected her to be. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. She checked the screen. It was an unknown number again. She hesitated for a moment, then answered it, hoping for some kind of clue, some breakthrough. "This is her name," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. The voice on the other end was different this time, sharp, nervous. "I know who you're dealing with," the voice said, low and fast. "You don't know the whole story. You think Caleb Thornton is the worst of it, but trust me, there's more. He's not the only one who's after that dealership." The woman's stomach flipped. "More? Who are you?" she asked, her tone more demanding now. "What do you know about Caleb?" "I can't say much," the voice replied, "but you need to understand something. Caleb isn't just interested in your dealership. He wants control of everything in this town. Every business, every deal, every person. And he doesn't take kindly to anyone who stands in his way." The woman clenched her fists, fighting to keep her emotions in check. Whoever this was, they knew things. But were they trying to help her, or was this just another trap? "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. The voice hesitated. "Because I can't stand by and watch him destroy everything. I've seen what he does to people who get in his way. It's not just about money for him. It's about power. And if you don't want to be his next target, you need to fight back." "How?" she asked, frustration rising. "I don't have the resources to take him on. He's got everything." "I know someone who can help," the voice replied quickly. "But you need to act fast. There's not much time. Caleb's making moves, and if you don't stop him now, he'll be too late." The woman's heart began to race. Who could help her? "Who are you?" she asked again, trying to get anything that would point her in the right direction. The voice on the other end was silent for a moment. Then, in a tone barely above a whisper, it said, "I can't say too much, but if you want to stop him, you need to meet me. I'll give you what you need to know. But you can't trust anyone else." Before she could respond, the line went dead. She sat there, staring at the phone, her mind swirling. Who was this? And why did they seem so desperate to warn her? There was no time to waste. Caleb Thornton had already made it clear that he wasn't going to back down. If she was going to survive this, and keep the dealership, she needed allies and fast. But could she trust this mysterious source, or was it another game being played at her expense? She stood up, her decision already made. There was no more time for waiting. She had to find this person. If they knew something about Caleb, something that could give her an edge, then she had to meet them, even if it was dangerous. The woman grabbed her coat and headed out of the office, the man in the suit following close behind. "Where are we going?" he'd asked, his voice sharp. "I'm meeting someone," she replied, keeping her tone even. "Someone who might be able to help us. But I need you to stay back. If this is a trap, I can't risk you getting caught up in it." He didn't argue. He simply nodded and followed her to the car. The drive through the dark streets felt like a journey into the unknown. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. Every turn, every shadow felt like a trap waiting to close in on her. But there was no going back. She had to face this head-on. They arrived at a quiet, nearly empty parking lot just outside of town. The woman's heart thudded in her chest as she parked the car, scanning the area. There was no sign of anyone waiting. She got out of the car, the cold night air biting at her skin. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a man, tall and unremarkable in appearance, but there was something about the way he moved that made her uneasy. He was watching her, waiting. "You're here," he said, his voice low. "Who are you?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. She didn't trust him, but she had to play along. The man stepped closer, glancing over his shoulder as if checking for any danger. "I'm the one who can help you take down Caleb Thornton," he said, his voice tense. "But I need you to listen to me carefully. You're walking into a war, and if you're not ready for it, you won't make it out alive." Her heart skipped a beat. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm, but inside doubt gnawed at her. Could she really do this? "Good," the man said. "Then let's get started. Because Caleb Thornton doesn't play by any rules, and neither should you." The man's words lingered in the air like smoke, thick with warning. Caleb Thornton doesn't play by any rules, and neither should you. The weight of those words sank into her chest as she stood in the cold parking lot, the darkness swallowing the space between them. The stranger's eyes were sharp, scanning the area like a hawk watching for danger. She had to decide quickly. Could she trust him, or was she walking straight into another trap? She steadied her breath, forcing herself to look beyond the tension. Caleb Thornton was already playing dirty. She didn't have the luxury of second-guessing now. If this man could truly help her take him down, then she had no choice but to take the risk. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. He paused for a moment, his gaze flickering to the shadows around them. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "What matters is how much you want to win this fight." Her eyes narrowed. "I'm not here to play games. I'm here to take back what's mine." He gave her a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "Good, because Caleb Thornton doesn't care who gets hurt in the process. He'll destroy everything you love if it means getting what he wants." The woman's heart raced at the thought. She had already seen how far Caleb was willing to go. The broken window, the threats, the phone call. This wasn't just about business for him. It was personal. And if she didn't act soon, she might lose everything she had worked for. She glanced at the man, trying to gauge whether he could be trusted. There was something about his demeanor that made her uneasy, something that suggested he had his own reasons for getting involved. But she couldn't afford to waste time on doubts. She needed to act, and she needed to do it fast. "Okay," she said, her voice firm. "What's the plan?" The man looked around again before stepping closer, lowering his voice even further. "Caleb has a lot of people working for him, but there's one who might be the key to getting to him. His right-hand man, Richard Hayes. He's the one who handles Caleb's dirty work. If you can get to Richard, you can get to Caleb. But it won't be easy. Hayes doesn't trust anyone, and he's always surrounded by bodyguards." She took in the information, her mind already working through the possibilities. "How do I get to him?" He shook his head. "It's not something you can just walk up to and demand answers. Hayes is always a step ahead. You'll need to find a way to get close to him, get him alone, and get him talking." The woman nodded slowly, piecing it all together. She'd been operating with limited information, but now she had something concrete to go on. Richard Hayes was the key to taking down Caleb Thornton. If she could get him to talk, she could unravel everything. But getting close to someone like Hayes wasn't going to be easy. She'd have to be careful, smart, and maybe even a little ruthless. The man seemed to read her thoughts. "There's one way in," he said, almost as if reading her mind. "Hayes frequents a private club on the edge of town. It's where he likes to relax, where he's most vulnerable. If you show up there, you'll get your chance. But it won't be safe. You'll need to be prepared." She didn't hesitate. "When do we go?" "Now," he replied, turning to lead the way to his car. "We don't have time to waste. The longer you wait, the more danger you're in." The woman followed him without another word. They drove in silence through the quiet streets, the weight of their mission pressing down on her chest. She thought about Caleb, about Richard Hayes, about everything that was at stake. She wasn't just fighting for the dealership anymore. She was fighting for her life, for her future, for everything she had worked to build. The club they were headed to was tucked away in a part of town that most people avoided, an unassuming building with blacked-out windows and a single bouncer standing outside. The woman could already feel the tension rising in her chest. This wasn't a place for people like her, people who played by the rules. But if she wanted to win, she had to step out of her comfort zone. She had to be ready to do whatever it took. The man in the suit parked the car in a dark alley across the street, and they both stepped out. He didn't say anything, just gestured for her to follow. As they crossed the street, the woman's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what to expect once they stepped inside, but she knew it wouldn't be good. The bouncer didn't even blink as they approached. He simply opened the door, letting them through with a curt nod. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with smoke and dim light. The club was filled with well-dressed men and women, their conversations low and hushed. The woman scanned the room quickly, looking for any sign of Richard Hayes. "He's in the back," the man in the suit muttered under his breath. "But you'll have to be careful. This place is full of his people. If you make a wrong move, it'll be over before it even starts." She nodded, her mind sharp with focus. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. They made their way through the club, the man leading the way with quiet confidence. The back area was separated from the main floor by a velvet rope, and as they passed through, the woman felt the eyes of several men on her. She kept her head down, trying to avoid drawing attention. And then she saw him. Richard Hayes sat at a table in the far corner, surrounded by a couple of bodyguards. He was talking to someone who looked important, but it was clear that Hayes was the one running the show. His presence was commanding, and the people around him seemed to respect him, even fear him. The woman's pulse quickened. This was it. She had one chance to get close to him, to find a way to make him talk. But as she moved closer, something unexpected happened. A loud crash echoed through the club. Glass shattered, followed by shouting. She froze, instinctively turning to look in the direction of the noise. The room erupted into chaos. People were scrambling to get away, some knocking over tables in their haste. The bodyguards around Richard Hayes sprang into action, grabbing their guns and heading toward the source of the disturbance. In the chaos, Richard Hayes stood up, his face a mask of irritation. But the moment he turned his back to the room, the woman saw her opening. She moved quickly, ducking under a table, and in seconds, she was at his side. She didn't have much time. She couldn't afford to waste a single second. She reached out, grabbing Hayes' arm. His eyes narrowed, and in that moment, everything slowed. The noise of the club seemed to fade away, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't just fighting for her dealership anymore. She wasn't just trying to survive. She was going to take back control, no matter the cost. "I need answers," she said, her voice steady, fierce. "And you're going to give them to me." Hayes smirked, clearly amused, but there was a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. "You think you can scare me?" he said, his voice low. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." She didn't let go of his arm. This was it. There was no turning back now. The chaos around them continued, but in that moment, it felt like the world had paused. All that mattered was what would happen next. The chaos of the club swirled around them, but the woman didn't let herself be distracted. Her hand remained firmly clasped around Richard Hayes' arm. His amused smirk had quickly faded into something far colder, more calculating. His eyes bore into hers, and for a moment, there was no pretense. He knew exactly what she was after, and he knew how dangerous it could be. "You're making a mistake," Hayes said in a low voice, his words measured and cold. He glanced around the room, clearly assessing his options, but he didn't make a move. Not yet. The woman held her ground. The moment she had been waiting for was now in her grasp. She had no idea how long she had before the club erupted into more chaos, or how many more of Hayes' bodyguards were in the room, but she didn't have time to waste. "I'm not here to make friends," she said, her voice unwavering. "I need answers, and you're going to give them to me. You and Caleb Thornton, what's really going on?" For a split second, Hayes hesitated, his sharp eyes narrowing as he assessed her. It was clear that he didn't think she was just another threat. There was a flicker of interest in his gaze, curiosity, perhaps, or maybe respect. But that didn't mean he was going to make things easy. "You think you can take him down?" he asked, the hint of a laugh in his voice. "You have no idea how deep this goes. It's not just the dealership, lady. It's bigger than that." The woman's grip tightened. "Tell me," she pressed, refusing to back down. "Tell me everything. or I'll make sure Caleb knows you were the one who talked. Your life won't be worth much after that." He chuckled softly, the sound unsettling. "Threatening me isn't going to get you anything. But I'll tell you what. You think you're ready to play in the big leagues, but you don't even know the game you're in." For a brief moment his gaze flicked to the side, his jaw tightening. She could see it now. A faint flicker of fear in his eyes. Maybe he wasn't as untouchable as he liked to think. "All right," he said after a long pause. "I'll give you this, but know that you're not going to like it." The noise from the club faded into the background as Hayes leaned in closer. He spoke quietly, his voice just above a whisper. "Caleb Thornton isn't after the dealership alone. He's been building an empire, one piece at a time. It's not just about the cars or the property. He's controlling the entire city. Every business, every deal, every single thing that happens in this town. And if you think you can stand against him, you're going to need more than just a car dealership. You'll need an army." The woman's heart raced, but she kept her face neutral. She was getting closer, but it wasn't the clean, simple answer she'd hoped for. There was something more, something even darker, lurking beneath the surface. "Why me?" she asked, her voice steady. "Why is Caleb targeting me and my dealership?" Hayes took a slow, deliberate breath. "You were supposed to be a pawn," he said, his tone colder now. "Craig, he wasn't just a failure as a businessman. He was a threat to Caleb's plans. But you're different. You're the wild card he didn't expect. And now you're in his sights. He'll do anything to break you, to take everything you've built." The words hit her like a blow to the chest, but she didn't flinch. She had already suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more real. Caleb wasn't just trying to take her business.